and he is in political science. He spent most of his 25-year professional...
The national election, the presidential election, and the senatorial election, did they surprise?
The time that I actually saw going up into the day before election where there was two sides that were both absolutely convinced that came very close to actually predicting all of the results. As a matter of fact, Florida, which they still hadn't called as of this morning, is the only state that really was kind of on the fence as to which direction it was going to go. I think if there was any surprise, it might have been that the Democrats outperformed probably expectations in the Senate. So I do think that that was somewhat of a surprise, but if you actually do take a look at some of the data, it was really not much of a surprise at all.
So I suppose it was not terribly surprising, the outcome, but the race in general I was probably most surprised by. The standard things that political scientists look at in terms of predictors, the fact that the economy, we still haven't come to terms with how the economy affected this particular race. One would have assumed months ago that President Obama was vulnerable because the economy was not very strong. And so political scientists have spent the last couple of decades really trying to figure out in what ways voters assess or weigh economic indicators when they vote for president. And so in this case, Obama kind of defied those odds by beating Romney in an environment where the economy is not great. That was probably the biggest surprise. The general outcome, not so much, because as you indicated, the aggregate models were pretty consistent about what was going to happen. And those of us that did look pretty carefully, I think, had a pretty good sense that barring a surprise or barring some sort of defect in the model, the president was likely to get reelected. So other than that, I would say the thing that probably surprised me most were just the general amount of money that was spent in this campaign. If you just go back over the last 10 years even, the explosion in contributions, independent expenditures, and then campaign contributions, I think is very surprising.
Talk about the changing demographics in this country, how it affected the election, and what's in store politically in the next 4 years.
So it's pretty obvious from Tuesday that the Republicans are going to have to reflect on how they can attract 21st century voters in terms of demographic changes in the country. And if the Republican Party doesn't have a national message that's going to be attractive to Hispanics, African Americans, Asians, even women compared to men in some respects, I think it'll be interesting to see over the next 2 years and then over the next 4 years as we go from 12 to then the midterms in 14, the general election in 2016, the extent to which the Republican Party is able to recalibrate without having core Republicans feel like their platform has been compromised. So I think the demographic changes are very real. The Obama campaign has been talking about them for a long time in terms of their predictive value, and I'm just curious to see how the GOP is able to sort of redirect their efforts and maybe try to peel away some of those voters, whether it be with certain candidates who are attractive. Marco Rubio is the easiest one to think of, but whether it has to do with specific candidates that they support or whether it's an actual substantive change to their message or their platform.
You know, I think the other thing that, you know, I actually shared this with the class that I taught this morning. If you take a look at the percentage of vote by white Americans in this election, it was about 72%. And that's been going down every year since 1996. If you extrapolate that line out by just 2 election cycles from now, it will be less than 65% of the total vote. When you're a candidate or a party that's not drawing outside of that particular vote, I think it causes some reasons for concern. But I think there's more to it than actually that, because I think that when you actually take a look at some of the other issues that exist, for instance, the 18 to 29-year-olds, they made up almost 20% of the electorate on Tuesday, which is relatively high for that group over the last few election cycles, and they voted 60 to 36 for the Democrats. Women, 12% advantage, they made up 53% of the electorate. If you actually add women, Hispanics, African Americans, and Asians, they made up 65% of the electorate on Tuesday, and they voted for Obama by a margin of 60 to 39. So I think that that's, if I'm an advisor for the Republican Party today, I really have to take a look at how I can actually change that particular dynamic or direction before I become relevant.
Now that they're going into the second administration, talk about what President Obama and his people have learned from this election and as far as going forward.
Well, you know, I think there's a couple of things that we can count on, and I think that there's a couple of things that we're going to just have to wait to see how they play out. If we take a look historically, second terms for presidents typically are not tremendously productive from a legislative standpoint. And the reason that that seems to have been, more than anything else, is that at least in recent past, second terms have been defined by the events, not the candidates themselves. With Nixon, you had Watergate. With Bush administration, you had the Afghan and Iraq War. And you basically had the impeachment for Bill Clinton that pretty much took his focus off of that. So I think that if history is going to be a guide, then I think that we don't have a whole lot of optimism to expect that we're going to see dramatic changes. However, having said that, I do think there are a couple of things that, based on the election on Tuesday, that we can pretty much count on at least being addressed in a relatively near-term perspective. One of the things is immigration reform. It was essentially supported by 2/3 of the electorate that came out to vote on Tuesday. It's something where the Obama administration has been advocating making changes, and I think now if I'm one of the advisors for the Republican Party, and I look at how do I go into the 2014 election, 2016 election, and say, if I want to make inroads with the Hispanic population in this country, then one of the things that probably is going to give me an opportunity to do that would be to actually go ahead and do something about immigration reform. So I think we can pretty much count on that. I think you also are going to basically see the Obama administration after the first term take their message out to the public more so than they did in the first term. I think that one of the things that they learned through this was that, you know, we have this thing in political science we call the bully pulpit, that the president actually has the ability to actually bring the message to the public and move Congress through that means. And I do think that that will be one of the things that you will see that will be a change in how at least they govern this country.
Grand bargain, grand bargain, grand bargain. It would be probably what I would look mostly for over the next 12 months. And I think there's a political scientist, I think he's at Duke, his name's James Stimson, and he has a little book called Public Opinion, Mood, Cycles, and Swings. And Professor Stimson argues that it's not unusual in elections when the party that wins the presidency thinks they have a mandate, no matter the size of the victory. Tuesday night was not terribly close. It was a close election, but not a sort of squeaker that someone would have expected. And Stimson argues that winning parties then overreach because they think they have more of a mandate to be more liberal or more conservative than the public's actually prepared for. So if I had an opportunity to speak to the president, I would say, don't overreach on this. And then we're at an interesting time, I think, where on most social issues, with the exception of abortion, most people are socially liberal, and there's a fiscal conservatism, I think, that lingers, that's sort of good news for the Republican Party. And so I would suggest that my guess would be that before January we get some sort of Band-Aid or patch on the fiscal cliff to buy us some time. And then I suspect, based on what Speaker Boehner said yesterday, that we are looking at some sort of effort to reform the tax code and get some sort of grand bargain on deficits and debt. That would be certainly what I'd be hoping for in the first year anyway. And then after that, maybe something on the DREAM Act.
What can be done to repair the political divide in the country now?
Turn off your radios and stop buying televisions, I suppose. Start reading newspapers again. I don't know. I don't know. So American Government 101 says, you know, when you talk to your students about media effects, and to your point on the bully pulpit, the traditional model was that the president had a unique ability to speak to the public. I'm not sure that that model still holds. I think that we're in this era where, for certain voters, Rush Limbaugh is more influential than President Obama, or the Huffington Post is more influential than President Obama. So I think we're at an unfortunate stage where scholars talk about narrowcasting or selective exposure. The people that are listening to Fox aren't listening to MSNBC and vice versa. And I think that's a really frightening reality. And both the parties, because of the way we reward the parties in frequent elections, both parties take advantage of that. So I think we have a lot more in common than we realize, liberals and conservatives and Democrats and Republicans, but our information system doesn't necessarily facilitate that realization. So I'm not sure what's going to happen, but it's a little bit disappointing. It's a little bit of a downer.
You know, I don't have a whole lot to add to that because I think Phil actually summed it up pretty much the same way that I would. It's one of the biggest concerns that I have from an electorate standpoint. You know, we always argue from a political science perspective whether or not the party dictates the partisanship or whether the partisanship moves the party. And I think we've come to a situation in this country right now where media is moving both parties further and further away. We have the ability to turn on whichever news basically suits our predefined notions that we already have. And I don't see that particular situation getting any better. The result that ends up coming out of that is that in order to get elected in a primary election, you have to run far more to the outer extremes than you ever had to before. And so there really is no ability to actually run as a more moderate candidate and win in both the primary and the general election in most districts. So I think this is a situation that unfortunately is not likely to change anytime in the near future, because we're going to continue as an electorate to elect more and more partisan members because that's the messaging that we expose ourselves to. And then by doing so, it's only going to cause the actual messaging to become more and more partisan.
I just would point out, too, that one of the things that was interesting to me Tuesday night was you had someone who, by a lot of indicators, not all indicators, so I don't mean to offend anybody here, you had someone who was outside the mainstream in Joe Walsh, who lost as a result of redistricting. That's basically what happened. Was the district lines were drawn by the General Assembly in Springfield to favor the Democrat, and lo and behold, the Democrat won. Right? And then you also had, in the same evening, someone that I would categorize for the most part as a moderate Republican, in Judy Biggert, who as a result of redistricting lost to Bill Foster, who had been out of Congress for 2 years as a result of redistricting. So I think it's a very interesting dynamic when you think about what exactly we're looking for, and as we talked about the consequences of primaries and the way that primaries work. Are we getting people, to Stimson's point about administration sort of missing that moderate mark, that centrist mark, and what the public kind of wants versus what really active groups get and the people that vote in primaries get? Are we losing out on candidates who maybe don't necessarily represent the views of a majority of us because the primaries are where the folks that can scream with their hair on fire the most effectively?
Here's a question from the audience. How can we get Congress to cooperate? If not, we won't get anything done.
Does anybody watch George Will on Sundays or read his stuff? Can I just get, like, asking for people you don't know to participate is an awful idea, but I'll ask anyway. George Will would say Congress isn't supposed to cooperate. George Will would say that the House is supposed to be this point of tension, the House of Representatives is supposed to be nasty and ugly, and the Senate is supposed to be the saucer that cools the milk, right, or cools the coffee, excuse me. So I think it depends on your perspective of the Constitution and what the framers really wanted. Did they want a legislative branch that things went slowly and it was difficult to implement change, or did they have in mind a more harmonious assembly where people did cooperate and work together? I think it's a lot more pronounced because of, again, the nature of our media system and the way the public, frankly, for the most part, does not follow politics, is not interested in politics, and is not informed about politics. And so that sort of intersection of a poorly informed electorate, a for-profit media system that narrowcasts to people, and the other things we've talked about today, that I'm not sure, but I don't know what the right answer is, except to say that there are many who would say Congress isn't necessarily supposed to be friendly and happy and cooperative. And as we talk about the Reagan-O'Neill era in the 80s, I'm not sure how much of that is, I mean, a lot of it is real, but some of it may just be reflecting on yesterday with optimism, not realizing that maybe that was kind of ugly too.
I'm a centrist.
Actually, if I had an answer to this question, I probably would have run on Tuesday because I think it would have been worth its weight in gold to actually be able to answer this question. You know, I have this discussion frequently in the classes that I teach, and one thing that I always want to harken back to is that the people that are in Congress today are there because we put them there. And so the real answer to this question about how we're going to get Congress to work together, I think in its most simplest form is we're going to need to elect better people. You know, we have a couple of problems that prevent us from doing that. One is the fact that money has become such an important part of our electoral process. As we talked before about, you know, my daughter actually came home and told me this particular number that I wasn't even aware of. But when you added up all of the congressional elections plus the presidential election, they spent $4.2 billion this election cycle. It's a phenomenal sum of money. And what that really does is it takes the everyday person out of the running for basically any of these particular positions. So, you know, I think we're all somewhat culpable in that. I tell my colleagues that from a political science perspective, we need to do better. You know, as the term I used the other day, we need to make political science more 50 Shades of Gray. But I think that, you know, we basically have to do a better job from a political science perspective of actually making political science more interesting so that the electorate actually is more in tune with what's going on. And I think that from an electorate standpoint, we need to do a better job of putting more qualified and better leaders in place.
The current process seems to eliminate some states from the campaign process. I doubt if either either candidate personally campaigned in California, New York, or Texas, since the electoral votes for these states were preordained. How do we solve this a little bit? I'd also add that a lot of the projections being made before, well, people were still voting in just when the booths closed.
One of my colleagues at NIU is originally from Canada, and he asked kind of a similar question about living in Illinois. Do I find it disheartening to live in a state that is already determined, that we already know who's going to win? And my response to him, in some respects, was no, not really. That's kind of the way our electoral process works, and I'm okay with that. You know, I think it's an easy target. The electoral process is an easy target to actually pick on. But when you actually take a look at what we've accomplished through it historically, we do a reasonable job from an electorate standpoint of choosing the right candidates, or at least the candidates that actually end up furthering the goals and ideals that we actually have. It's one of the things that we actually do. I could certainly be persuaded to say that we should go to a system more like the state of Nebraska has, where the electoral votes are actually awarded both on the congressional district level as well as the overall state popular vote level. But in essence, there's only been 2 elections, I believe, that we've actually had a different winner from a popular vote standpoint than a electoral vote standpoint. So I'm not sure that it's a huge problem that needs to be solved.
Yeah, I think 2012 shows us that the Electoral College and the popular vote are in harmony with one another. The one thing that the electoral vote does is it inflates someone's victory. So Obama, it looks like he's beaten Romney by about 2.5 million votes. George W. Bush beat John Kerry in 2004 by about 3.3 million votes. And yet Obama's Electoral College victory in 12 will be higher than Bush's was in 4, if that makes sense. So the Electoral College inflates that victory and gives a sort of quasi-mandate, I think. But at least in this election cycle, it wasn't off. As recently as a few days before the election, some political scientists and analysts were saying that maybe Obama was going to get the electoral vote and Romney the popular vote, but that didn't happen. So I suppose that in the end, that's okay. But I'm kind of ambivalent about the strengths and weaknesses of the Electoral College. I think it's a conversation among others that we could have as a country about things that we might potentially change. Primary system being one of the ones that stands out as well. 2-year terms for representatives, I think, is another one that we just are constantly doing it again and again and again. And Well, I don't know, someone asked the question about visits to California, Texas, and what was the other state?
New York.
In New York. They may not have been on the stump in California, but I promise you they went to California, New York, and Texas to get money, because they all worked very diligently this cycle to go to those states to get cash. So,
With the threats of repeal of Obamacare having passed, but with challenges to the HHS mandate pending in a number of federal court actions around the country, what is your prediction as to the ultimate resolution of the requirement for religiously affiliated organizations, schools, hospitals, etc., to provide coverage for contraception to their employees?
You know, not to chicken out on this one, but I will. What I will say is that I'm not a legal scholar by any stretch of the imagination, so all you will be getting is one man's opinion. And you know, I think the fact that the, you know, blessed is probably the wrong word, but the fact that the Supreme Court actually did support most provisions of the Obamacare legislation just this past year, it's probably going to damper a lot of the chances of seeing it being changed. I think for the most part you're going to see it implemented pretty much right now as it was intended.
I don't know either, but I know that the Supreme Court's looking at that aspect of the mandate, the extent to which religious institutions can be compelled to provide contraception, for example, for their employees. And I think that aspect of it, I think the Affordable Care Act as a whole is here to stay and probably going to continue to be tweaked. But I have a suspicion that that's one aspect within the next several months to a year that the court might say, you've got to modify that part. Because I know the Catholic Church and other affiliated institutions are up in arms about it. So it won't surprise me if the Supreme Court says that part has to be changed.
Should we reinstate the Truth in Reporting Act, and how will that help things in the future that can be done?
Again, I'm not sure actually what the question's actually getting at there.
Is that like the fairness doctrine? That's what
You know, actually what I'm going to do is I'm going to pass on this one because I'm not sure actually what the question is getting at.
I assume it's about the fairness doctrine and whether in radio, for example, is the one that's been talked about most recently, whether there needs to be fair amount of time given to both sides on a given issue. And I would say if that's what the question is about, it's absolutely not. That yesterday's ability to learn about politics was based on radio and then television and now sort of radio and the internet, and we're still feeling our way as to what we're going to see in the future, but I don't think any sort of regulatory approach is going to work because both sides have the internet, right? That's the big one, that young people are following politics online. They're watching television programs online. So in terms of fair access, it's out there. And if anything, we selectively expose ourselves to too much stuff. The problem isn't that the information's out there, it's that we're putting on blinders to the other side.
Here's an opinion and a question from somebody. I think our country has become addicted to entitlements. What do you think?
Yeah. It just depends what kind of country you want and how you perceive the social safety net. And if you think that people who, when they're, not to have anybody throw any food at me, but reference Paul Krugman briefly. When Krugman talks about, do you want a 68-year-old firefighter coming to your house to rescue you? Do you want, right? Do we reach a point in life where not just skilled labor, but in other positions, we change the way we work? And if that's the case, then what's a reasonable age when we can retire? And if we retire, how do we want to provide service or provide those protections for people? And it's a long-standing debate. I don't know. But I think there's no question, as someone who's left of center, I like Social Security and Medicare, and my really liberal friends don't like me for that, for this next statement. But you all know this probably. We are going broke. And there is an iceberg ahead, and the question is, how are we going to veer away from it if we can? So I think Republicans, are for the most part right about pointing out that the math doesn't add up, And that Medicare is the first one that we have to recalibrate. And I'm optimistic that we'll actually do that, to be honest with you. I think there's an opportunity now in the next 2 to 4 to 6 years to try to do something, basically because our backs are against the wall. But personally, I like entitlements. I like both programs and Medicaid, but they clearly aren't paying for themselves, and something's not right. I'll leave now, like that.
You know, there's a relatively well-known political scientist, Mansur Olson, who did a lot of work with collective action. And one of the main points of his research was this notion that there are collective goods that we should have. The national defense would be a great example of a collective good that I think all of us would agree that should exist, and it's one of the responsibilities of government. You know, I think that Phil mentioned another one when he was talking about fire protection. I think few of us would believe that anyone should basically have their home on fire and not have a fire department that's capable of actually trying to put it out. You know, I really believe to a certain extent in American exceptionalism, and to me one of the things and one of the tenets of that is that we should have a basic minimum standard of living that we accept that all people should be entitled to in this country that we actually have. And when you actually start to see poverty rates that we have in this country today that are approaching those of third world status, I don't think that we're actually at that level at this particular point in time. So I believe that if we're going to say, are we addicted to entitlements? Well, maybe there's some entitlements that we have that we should probably scale back on, but in some cases, we're not doing a good enough job. We're not providing at a bare minimum level some of the things that we should be providing, so I'm not sure that we're actually there yet.
And I'm going to veer off the beaten path just for a minute to sort of maybe tie things together a little bit as a crazy hack for just a second. I think if the average Illinoisan knew how long Speaker Madigan had been in the speakership, and again, I'm a blue state guy, but if the average person knew that we had a leader who basically had designed a system to stay in power for 30 plus years, like it, not like it, that's fine, but in terms of our understanding of representative democracy, I think that's a real big pill to swallow, to understand how that works. And then people that follow Illinois politics and our culture and corruption and everything else, I think it feeds back to public lack of knowledge about these things, and then whether or not that's really the structure of leadership, whether the person is good or bad, whether the structure of leadership is that someone should again and again and again be in the most powerful position in the state. And ironically, it's a position that probably 70% of Illinoisans have no idea who the person is, what the role is, maybe couldn't identify Springfield on a map. So it's a challenge.
Thank you. Do we have time for questions from the audience? No. No? Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much.